Today, the United Nations is an international organization whose goal is to aid different nations in law, security, economic development, and equality. For those same reasons, it was developed in 1945 during World War II at the signing of the UN Charter at the San Francisco Conference by 51 countries. It replaced the League of Nations, which was founded after World War I in 1919. We are taught that the UN began with the signing of the UN Charter in 1945. In fact, the United Nations organization was created earlier with the signing of the Atlantic Charter by the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt aboard warships in Newfoundland. It was issued as a joint declaration on August 14, 1941. This statement was drafted and agreed while the British were fighting in World War II against Nazi Germany. However, there was no formal legal document entitled the Atlantic Charter. The United States did not enter the war until later after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Potentially, it would detail the goals and aims of the Allied powers concerning the war and the post-war world. The ideals expressed through the 8 points of the Atlantic Charter were so popular that the Office of War Information prints 240,000 posters of it in 1943. History shows that Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt created the UN Charter to win the war both militarily and politically, and to create the foundations for a lasting peace. The United Nations became the official name of the group known as the Allies, fighting the Axis powers in 1942, when FDR and Churchill led 26 nations in a declaration by the UN, including the Soviet Union and China. The declaration committed the signers not to make a separate peace and to stick to the principles of the Atlantic Charter. The Charter provided the political basis for countering Nazi ideology. Especially in the United States, the United Nations was soon used in propaganda posters. The United Nations was the term used broadly for what we now call the Allies. The enemy states began to surrender to the United Nations. In Europe, General Eisenhower accepted the surrender of fascist Italy in September 1943. Eisenhower transferred to England to prepare for the liberation. His orders from the Chiefs of Staff to conduct the D-Day landing stated that he was to do so in conjunction with the other United Nations. Eisenhower broadcasted the troops on D-Day, reminded them that the United Nations defeated the Germans, and explained that the landings were part of the United Nations plan. The document that formalized the Nazi defeat described that this was being done on behalf of the United Nations. It was normal to talk about the United Nations fighting the war and to explain that the crimes that occurred in the concentration camps were not revealed until the armies of the United Nations overran Germany.
Here in secrecy off the Newfoundland coast, an inspiring document would be born. Meeting aboard the American cruiser Augusta came ranking military and civilian representatives of Britain and America. History was about to be made as England's honored Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had sailed undercover to Newfoundland on the new British battleship Prince of Wales, now boarded the USS Augusta. His host, President Roosevelt, who had secretly transferred to the Augusta from his yacht. The meeting purpose, the writing of the famed Atlantic Charter. Churchill climbed more than a ladder here. He was rising to one of the most lofty ideals to come out of the war. Admiral King and other high-ranking officers were planning the preservation of our Atlantic defense line, but it was to Roosevelt and Churchill that the most vital task fell. While the Augusta's decks bustled with activity, General Arnold waited with others upon the results of the meeting in the quiet stateroom above. The Atlantic Charter completed, Roosevelt returned Churchill's visit by attending church services aboard the HMS Prince of Wales. The leaders of two mighty nations had drafted a document which stated their aims to the tyrants of the world in the name of free men everywhere. Behind their moral alliance, though the United States was not yet at war, was the formidable striking force of Anglo-American unity, the arsenal of democracy. The end of the secret meeting came with the knowledge of great accomplishment. The Charter declared that America and Britain sought no aggrandizement or territory. In powerful coalition, Roosevelt and Churchill demanded the right of all peoples to choose their own forms of government. Laying the groundwork for the United Nations, their document cleared the way for all nations to join together in mutual respect and safety. The Atlantic Charter stands majestically among the milestones of the century.
My name is Bruce Fitzpatrick, and I grew up in Ship Harbor, Placenta Bay, Newfoundland in 1941. I was 10 years old at the time. My brother and I decided to sneak up after school to Lookout Hill, which is about 200 feet from Ship Harbor. We had a terrific view of history being made below, but we didn't know it then. I remember 3 boats, which I later found out were HMS Prince of Wales and the USS Augusta, all anchored in the entrance of Ship Harbor. It was a big secret, but we all knew something monumental was taking place. I later learned that during the time we were seeing the development of the Atlantic Charter and the U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill meeting and discussing the terms of what later became the basis for the United Nations. Today, the United Nations is often regarded as a result of the Allied victory. At the time, the UN organization created in San Francisco was regarded as a result of war effort, but it is clear that it began in 1941, 4 years earlier.